welcome back to our study of Revelation. This is session 7. So what is this book? What is this book that we call Revelation? It's perhaps not a straightforward answer. It is a long letter. It was a long letter written to be circulated amongst 7 churches. So it's a letter. But it's also an apocalypse. It is perhaps the best example of apocalyptic writing that we have surviving from the ancient world. So it's a letter. It is an apocalypse. But it is also, by its own self-description, a prophecy. John considers himself to stand in the tradition of the prophets of old. And he refers to the book 6 different times as a prophecy. So it is a letter, it is very much apocalyptic, and it's a prophecy. In Revelation 10, we get a clear indication that John sees himself standing in the line of the great prophets. So the term prophet, Navi in Hebrew, refers to someone who speaks for God. At heart, that is what a prophet is. A prophet is someone who speaks for the Almighty. A prophet at times does foretell the future, but not necessarily. The heart of prophecy is always speaking God's word into the contemporary situation. And sometimes that involves foretelling the future, but not necessarily. So the point is that they were spokesmen for God. They are spokespersons for God, and they were giving God's view, God's word into that contemporary time. Sometimes the word of the prophets was a word of comfort, other times as a word of judgment and condemnation. But they were God's mouthpieces. In a 1927 book, the writer James Weldon Johnson referred to African American preachers as God's trombones, so we can envision the prophets of old being God's trombones, being the mouthpieces of God, shouting forth, speaking forth clearly and powerfully as a trombone of the voice of the Lord. John, at the end of Revelation 10, is commanded to eat a scroll. And he is told to prophesy about peoples, nations, languages, and kings. We're told that the scroll would be sweet in his mouth, sweet as honey in his mouth, but would turn his stomach bitter. His prophetic counterparts, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, did similar things. In Ezekiel's call to prophetic ministry, he is commanded to eat a scroll, which we are told was sweet as honey in his mouth. Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 15, refers to eating God's word. Thinking out loud, is it possible that we who are followers of Christ can conceive of the Lord's Supper as being a call to prophetic ministry? In the Lord's Supper, at least in a spiritual sense, we are feasting on the eternal word. In feasting on the eternal word in the Lord's Supper, can we conceive ourselves as being called to prophetic ministry? Just a possibility. Also, in the books we've looked at for today, we'll be encountering a temple. Here in Revelation, you see a description of an enormous, fantastical temple, and you'll be asked to reflect on that. So what actually is a temple? A temple, or the temple, in the Old Testament was the successor to the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a movable tent that was the house of worship. When the people moved, When the people moved, they packed up the tabernacle and moved it and set it up. You may recall the pillar of cloud, pillar of fire. If the pillar of cloud by day, fire by night moved, they packed everything up and moved the tabernacle and set it up elsewhere. And the pillar would rest upon the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. The tabernacle was the location for the sacrifices. As the people entered the promised land, after they enter the promised land, they set up a permanent capital in Jerusalem, and God instructed Solomon to build a temple, a permanent house for himself, a permanent house of worship. And this is built roughly 900 BC. And the glory of God, we are told, dwelt in this temple. The glory of God dwelt in Solomon's temple. And it was here that animal sacrifices took place. With the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586, 587 BC, the temple was destroyed. Ezekiel, while he was exiled by the Kavar Canal in Babylon, saw a vision of the glory of God leaving the temple. Later, after some of the exiles returned, Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple as part of their return, as part of rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. The sacrificial system was restored. Several hundred years later, as part of his enormous building projects in and around Jerusalem, the evil king Herod rebuilt the temple, greatly expanded it. The visitor to Jerusalem today can still see some of the stones at the base of the Temple Mount. Some of them weigh some 500 to 600 tons. The size of the temple was doubled. In Herod's reconstruction, the size of the temple was doubled. A pilgrim crossing over the top of the Mount of Olives could have been blinded just by the sun glistening off the limestone of the temple. Eventually, the Romans destroyed this temple as well in 70 AD. Centuries later, as Muslims conquered the area, shrines, two of their holy sites, were built on top of the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. Both are situated now on top of the Temple Mount where Solomon's temple would have been. Ezekiel in chapter 40 through 48 sees an incredible vision of a temple. Just an incredible vision as a temple. As part of your work this session, you'll be asked to reflect on the temple that John sees in Revelation 11. What was this temple that John sees in Revelation 11? Is it somehow a reference back to Solomon's temple, or Herod's temple, or a temple yet to be built in the future? Enjoy your discussion.